Greetings to everyone around the world joining us for this event today in whatever time zone you may find yourself. We're very pleased to have attendees not only from North America and Europe, but from Russia, China, India, Nigeria, and a number of other countries in the RVP network. I'm Bill Barbieri, and in the name of the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy and the George McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values at Catholic University, I welcome you to today's lecture by Hans Joas on the myth of disenchantment and the power of the sacred. If you're just becoming acquainted with the Council, we are a global network of over 5,000 scholars, primarily in the humanities and social sciences, founded by the philosopher George McLean over 40 years ago, and dedicated to collective inquiry into the deep relations between values, culture, and today's existential challenges. You can learn more about our conferences, publications, and research initiatives at crvp.org. We're privileged to have today as our speaker one of the foremost social theorists of our time. So probing and versatile is Hans Joas's scholarship that it has made his work foundational across several academic fields. Thus, books of his such as Social Theory and Social Action and Social Action and Human Nature have made seminal contributions to sociological theory. His studies of George Herbert Mead and his book Pragmatism and Social Theory mark him as one of the leading interpreters of American pragmatism. Two of his books from the 1990s, The Creativity of Action and The Genesis of Values, are essential reading for those interested in social fundamentals of ethics. He's produced influential investigations of war and conflict in works such as War and Modernity and War in Social Thought. Two more recent contributions, The Sacredness of the Person and The Axial Age and Its Consequences, provide indispensable perspectives on moral universalism and human rights. And with titles such as Do We Need Religion and Faith as an Option, he has staked his claim as a penetrating analyst of the dynamics of religion and secularity. Today we have the opportunity to hear how he is turning his talents to nothing less than a reconstruction of the modern history and theory of religion. It's a notable feature of our speaker that just as his studies knit together different fields, his labors bridge national boundaries. In combining his posts at a number of prominent universities and institutes in his native Germany and Sweden, with a long-standing appointment at the University of Chicago, he has, like few others, succeeded in navigating and bringing together European and American traditions and discourses. This engagement has extended to his activities as a public intellectual and proud social democrat, which have seen him become not only a prominent voice in public affairs in Germany, but also emerge as a contributor to the movement of communitarianism in the US. And perhaps nothing says more about Hans's ecumenical sensibilities than the fact that he currently serves, a bit incongruously perhaps, as a sociologist of the Catholic persuasion on the Protestant faculty of theology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Having been rewarded for his many achievements with the Niklas Luhmann Prize, the Werner Heisenberg Medal, the Hans Killian Award, a Max Planck Research Award, and the Prix Paul Ricoeur, Hans, I fear, may be running out of named honors that he can win. The occasion for our event today is the eagerly awaited appearance in English of yet another major book, Die Macht des Heiligen, published last month by Oxford University Press in a luminous translation by Alex Skinner under the title, The Power of the Sacred, an alternative to the narrative of disenchantment. In this work, as we will hear, Hans critically assesses some features of the legacy of no less a figure in the sociology of religion than Max Weber, and at the same time takes steps toward establishing his own distinctive account of the dynamics of sacralization in modern societies. Before we begin with this lecture, just a few items of housekeeping. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Institute for Policy Research and the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of America, and of course, Oxford University Press. Second, as to our format today, Hans will speak for roughly 40 minutes, and then at that point, we will hear responses from a couple of his old friends, namely Charles Taylor and José Casanova, whom I will briefly introduce at that time. We will have a bit of back and forth with those panelists, and then we will open the floor to questions from the audience in the remaining time before we adjourn at 11:30 Washington time. Finally, to that end, we encourage you to use the Q&A function in the webinar at any time to submit your queries and comments for Hans Joas. Although there's a large audience today, we will do our best to get your questions aired. With those items out of the way, and without further ado, Hans, you may approach the podium and take it away.
Greetings from my side also to everybody. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to you, Bill, for having organized this event and for the many intellectual exchanges we have had over the last years. I would also like to thank Charles Taylor and José Casanova for being willing to comment on my presentation, and also for many years of cooperation, particularly the year we shared at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And I'm grateful to all of you for your interest in my work. Now, the book, The Power of the Sacred, is a rather long and, if I may say so, complex book. But I mentioned that because I have to restrict myself in this presentation to three aspects of it. First, I will say something about one might call the motivational background for writing this book. Second, I will give a glimpse into what is the critical part of the book, namely my critique of Max Weber's extremely famous and influential narrative of Disenchantment. And third, I will offer at least some components of what I think could be an alternative to the Weberian narrative. The alternative, of course, is in need of further elaboration, and I might mention that this is what has occupied me to a large extent since finishing the book we are talking about in the German original about 4 years ago. Okay, first part, motivational background. I do not mean that in a highly personal sense now. And what I'm going to say in this first part is not really contained in the book, but it may make more understandable what I'm aiming at. I think it's obvious that the background of this book is in the debates and the critiques of so-called secularization theory or the secularization theses. There was much debate about that in the last 20 or 30 years. And of course, both Charles Taylor and José Casanova are among the key contributors to this debate. And I, as Bill has just mentioned, have myself contributed to that in the book Faith as an Option, published by Stanford University Press, where the title clearly alludes to Charles Taylor's work, namely to his analyses of the rise of the secular option that makes faith another option. Nobody can be a believer today in most countries of the world without knowing very well how easy it would be not to be a believer. Now, of course, when we talk about secularization and criticize the secularization thesis, this does not mean that we deny the fact that there is a decline of religion in some parts of the world, above all in Europe. I mention that just because it's so often probably not necessary in this context here, but it happens very often to me that people say you are well known as a critic of the secularization thesis, but you cannot deny that religion has become weaker in Scandinavia or in France or in Germany or in the Netherlands and so on. And that I'm not denying that at all. I mean, I spent most of my time in Berlin and East Germany, which, as some of you may know, could be called the world champion of secularization. So the critique of the secularization thesis does not mean there is no secularization, but means that a certain conventional explanation for secularization, namely that modernization processes necessarily lead to secularization, that this explanation is not really plausible. Okay, I will not say more about that, but I just needed these few words to explain what the connection between these earlier attempts to criticize the secularization thesis and so on and the present book is. Namely, if we consider secularization mostly as a phenomenon of European history and of European history, let's say, since 1700, then the question cannot be avoided. How do we explain that? Do we explain modern European secularization out of the conditions in Europe in the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st centuries? Or do we assume that there is something in Christianity or in the Judeo-Christian tradition that over time, more or less necessarily, had to lead to this modern secularization, so that secularization is only the late outcome of a process that started, as some would say, 2,500 years ago. If we stick to the program to explain modern European secularization out of the modern European conditions, we still have to distinguish, and I think Charles Taylor has done that masterfully, between the conditions for the rise of what he calls the secular option and the conditions for the acceptance of this newly emerging secular option. Why do certain people, why do certain social milieus accept or appropriate this secular option, and why do others not and stay with the faith or rephrase their religious convictions, modify them to some extent, give a new form to them? Now, the other explanation that I mentioned, namely that secularization is, so to speak, the late outcome of a much longer world historical process, was defended by some of the most influential European thinkers around 1900. Let me just mention as one of them, Friedrich Nietzsche, and to put his idea in this area in a nutshell, he defended the idea that truthfulness is a deeply Christian value. If Christians believe in the value of truthfulness, he said, they cannot avoid asking questions about the reliability of their own sacred books. They cannot forget the fact that there are inner contradictions in the Bible, that the four Gospels, for example, do not give us exactly the same picture of Jesus and Jesus' activities and sermons and so on. So that for him, Christians at a certain point, just on the basis of their Christian values, had to develop a kind of historical criticism of the Bible that then shatters the foundations of their own faith and is a main contribution to intellectual secularization. So that's one deeply influential version. The even more influential version, I think, is the one that goes back to Max Weber and his narrative of disenchantment. For Weber, who was influenced by Nietzsche, but still differs from Nietzsche in very important respects, the whole process, the world historical process of disenchantment, started 2,500 or more years ago with the struggle of the Hebrew prophets against magic. Now, what I'm doing in this book is mostly analyzing this narrative construction, showing its ambiguities and attempting to offer an alternative to it. So that was the first part. Let me just briefly mention at the end of this first part, as I said, what I have said so far is not contained in the book. It's only intended to give you an impression and a better understanding of what I'm aiming at. What is contained in the book, in the first 3 chapters of it, is a discussion of the relationship between faith and scientific or scholarly study in the 3 empirical disciplines that deal with religion. I call them empirical disciplines because it's not so much about philosophy nor about theology, but about history of religion, psychology of religion, and sociology of religion. And I need these 3 parts because they allow me to collect material, so to speak, for my own understanding of religion, and also to show how I myself balance between religious convictions, faith-based convictions, and let's say a scientific or more generally cognitive validity claims. And I do that by studying crucial constellations in each of these 3 disciplines. Just to mention them very, very briefly, David Hume's contribution to a kind of secularized historiography of religion in the 18th century and the reaction of crucial German late 18th century thinkers like Johann Gottfried Herder to Hume, William James and Josiah Royce in the 2nd chapter, and Fustel de Coulanges and Emile Durkheim for the origins of the empirical sociological study of the world history of religion. Okay, so much on the first part. Second part, about Max Weber and his understanding. Now, you all know that this notion of disenchantment, or terms like disenchanted and so on, are currently being extremely frequently used in the literature. Somebody has written there is not 1 year in the last decades in which not at least 1 book has been published that has the term disenchantment in its title. And of course, there are many more articles that do the same. And this is not just a German phenomenon, as one might expect, because of the enormous influence Max Weber's thinking has in Germany, but it's clearly an international phenomenon. In the English language, new words were created that are derived from the term that is being used for the English translation of Max Weber, namely disenchantment. The new words are words like re-enchantment or enchantment. Both cannot be found in Weber, but are now quite common in the German language too, not only in English. An excellent contemporary Protestant theologian in Germany, Jörg Lauster from the University of Munich, has published an excellent cultural history of Christianity and called it in German, the enchantment of the world. So it's very clear that what he has in mind is also an opposition to Max Weber's narrative of disenchantment, but I think too simple an alternative, because you clearly cannot simply turn the disenchantment narrative around and describe the history of Christianity as if it were a constant process of growing enchantment of the world. So in this situation, I realized that the term, despite being used so frequently, is surprisingly unclear. Just one example, many people to whom I've talked assume that somehow modern science, according to Weber, is one of the main causes of this process of disenchantment. But it is easy to find in Weber's writings passages in which he says, for example, that the Reformation, particularly Calvin, is the high point or even the conclusion of the world historical process of disenchantment. So Calvin is not famous for his scientific achievements and clearly comes before the most important processes of the modern scientific revolution. So in this situation, I decided to make a painstaking philological, I sometimes say microscopic analysis of all the passages in which Max Weber ever used the term disenchantment, disenchanted, and so on. Now, don't worry, I will not present this detailed philological study on this occasion. It's also only a small part of the book. It's part of one of the 7 chapters of the book. And actually, Bill Barbieri told me that it may be that the audience on this occasion is not mostly interested in these details, but you have to understand that to make my claims plausible, and this in a cultural environment in which many people are extremely identified with Weber's thinking, one has to be as precise as possible. So I will just mention that perhaps it comes as a surprise to some of you, that Max Weber used the term in all his writings only 17 times, and only from a rather late point of his life on. The first time he used it is in an article published in the year 1913, so only 7 years before his death. It is the article that has the title in English, Some Categories of Interpretive Sociology. The term disenchantment, or the original German term is Entzauberung, appears only once in this huge compilation of fragments from Max Weber that was published under the title Economy and Society, and that is considered to be his main work. It doesn't even appear in the index there of the original publication in the early 20s. The term appears 4 times in Weber's perhaps most influential text, namely the essay on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, but not in its original version of 1904, only in its revised version of 1920. It appears 4 more times in his comparative studies of the economic ethics of the world religions. It appears 6 times in his speech, Science as a Vocation, and once in the posthumously published lectures on economic history, never in his existent letters. Now, as I said, I will not go through these 17 passages and not interpret them. I will perhaps just in an exemplary way mention the first one in this article, Some Categories of Interpretive Sociology. There, he doesn't offer a definition of disenchantment, nothing like that. What he does is he discusses magic and the possibility for social scientists to understand magic. And what is relevant for us now is that in this passage, he treats religion as something that has to adapt to a process in which magic gets weaker. So it's certainly not, has nothing to do with secularization in this passage. And Talcott Parsons, the very famous sociologist of the 1950s and 60s, who also translated parts of Weber's writings, did not choose the term disenchantment for his translation, but elimination of magic from the world. And at least for this first passage, this is an appropriate translation, I would say. Now, what Weber says in this passage is that if magic disappears or becomes weaker, religion has to change its character. Religion becomes de-magified, so to speak. And he gives two examples how religion can become under the conditions of a weakening of magic. Namely, it either becomes, I would translate, more conscientious, or it becomes more mystical. Unfortunately, you cannot have a sense of these nuances when you read the English translation, because what Weber says in German, gesinnungshaft, is translated into the word ethical, which doesn't show what Weber has in mind, namely that if you do not believe in the possibility of a self-interested transaction with the divine, your religious conviction become more principled or more conscientious. Okay, I will not continue like that, because one would have to have texts available and discuss the correct interpretation of these texts. I will jump to the systematic conclusion I draw from this philological interpretive work. The conclusion is that Max Weber indeed uses the term disenchantment and Zauberung in very different ways. Now, to demonstrate what the different meanings are, I had to invent ugly new terms, so to speak. But maybe they are able to show immediately that these are different meanings and that we should not lump these different meanings together. So the different meanings I have in mind are first, and you will not be surprised to hear that, demagification. That was the original meaning in Weber. Second, something I call desacralization. Now, I would need much more time to explain what I personally mean by the sacred and so on. But at that point, I perhaps should simply say that means something, and there are passages in Weber that shows that very clearly, that one could call the loss of inherent meaning, that people do not experience something in the world as being inherent, or their own actions as being inherently meaningful, but as being merely causally determined, so that it's just a universe of causal mechanisms, so to speak, and nothing is sacred in itself. Third meaning, de-transcendentalization, the loss of transcendence, the loss of the belief that there is something, and that belief has existed since the axial age, that is fundamentally different from the sphere of the mundane or the immanent. And fourth, of course, one could say secularization. So if that is correct, if Weber's notion has different meanings, and if we clearly have to distinguish these different meanings, one can ask, but why is it that nobody has realized that before? I think the reason for that is that Weber brought these different meanings together in one narrative. One narrative that starts with the process of demagification in the case of the Hebrew prophets, as I said, but then leads to later phases, and it looks as if later phases of desacralization or detranscendentalization and even of secularization are just later phases of the same world historical process of disenchantment. I think it's not unfair to Weber if I say that the basic structure of his view of at least modern Western history is that it all started with ancient Judaism and a struggle against magic, that this also plays a role in early Christianity, but that medieval Christianity is a kind of regression, that the Reformation is the renewal of the original prophetic impulse, And then tragically, this renewal of the prophetic impulse leads to the modern scientific revolution, to Enlightenment thinking, to a worldview of causal mechanisms, and this to the deep crisis of meaning, of existential meaning in the fin de siècle, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and just before the First World War and in the First World War, so the time in which Max Weber wrote these things. Now, at this point already, and still in the second part, I would like to say, I think if we make this conceptual distinction, what we see is, yes, Weber was right in many respects with regard to individual analyses. There are processes of demagification in the world, but they are not just the hour in which a world historical process of demagification begins, because there are always also new processes of remagification. There are processes of desacralization, but there are also processes in which new sacralizations come up, or an old sacredness regains its vitality. There are processes of de-transcendentalization, but also new processes of the strengthening of the concept of transcendence, or of something that transcends all given particularities in social entities. And of course, there are processes of secularization, but there are also processes of religious revitalization. Incidentally, both José Casanova and I have often put great emphasis on the fact that three conceptual distinctions are often conflated in the literature, in the sociology of religion, namely the distinctions between sacred and profane, transcendent and immanent, and religion and secular. And I can easily use the distinction between these three distinctions to make clear what I have said so far. So the conclusion of the second part then is that I'm saying it is indeed a myth, in the critical sense of the word, a myth to say there is one world historical process of disenchantment. What we have are difficult fields of tension between processes, for example, of desacralization and new sacralizations, between de-transcendentalization and new versions of the understandings of transcendence, and so on and so on. This leads me to the third part, a sketch of the alternative to the myth of disenchantment. Now, I know, and I know from one recent review of the French translation of the book, that some people expect, let's say, one counter notion to the notion of disenchantment. Okay, they want to hear, okay, there is not one world historical process of disenchantment, but one world historical process of something else. Now this, of course, I cannot offer, and I do not want to offer, because I want to treat history as open and contingent. So there is no alternative teleology, so to speak, but the reconstruction, as I said, of fields of tension with different outcomes, where the outcome, to a large extent, also and mostly depends on human action or on intellectual contributions as the background for actions. Now, in the last part of the book that is now out in English, The Power of the Sacred, I distinguish between three main components of this alternative history. And I'm pretty sure that what I'm going to say now will to some extent be difficult to understand, because in each of the three cases, I would have to say much more, and to a large extent, I have said much more in some other of my books. But so let me just mention the three and say a few words about the three. The first is self-sacralization. I mean, I do indeed think that there are always new processes of sacralization. Persons become sacralized, places become sacralized, ideas and ideals, so to speak, become sacralized. What makes me so self-confident in making that claim, that has to do with the understanding of religion as something that cannot be analyzed apart from the structure and the dynamics of human experience, that among the manifold types of human experience, there are certain experiences, Max Weber called them extraordinary, außeralltäglich, I call them experiences of self-transcendence, that are different from everything that is experienced in the everyday life, and that in such experiences, we experience something outside of ourselves as captivating us, seizing us, a force that transforms us, a force that is not of our own making. And pre-reflectively, we attribute this force to persons, to objects, to ideas. And if we experience in this pre-reflective manner, then we experience these objects, persons, ideas as sacred. This, I emphasize, this happens on the pre-reflective level, but of course we have to find an evaluation of our primary processes of sacralization on the reflective level. We can interpret this as a temptation, experience this, the sacred. Emil Durkheim already made that very clear, as demonic or diabolical, or we can interpret it in a morally positive sense as sacred in the sense of very morally good, acceptable, or deeply motivating. And so a term that plays an important role in my book is the term the formation of ideals. How do ideals come into the world? And I'm very enthusiastic about some of the thinkers my argument is based on, from Ernst Troeltsch to H. Richard Niebuhr, for their contribution to an understanding of the processes of the formation of ideals. Okay, that's the first component. The second component is, the second basic idea of my alternative conception is the following. I make the claim that when processes of sacralization happens, this sacralization is always originally also to some extent the self-sacralization of the collectivity that is the origin of this understanding of the sacred. So when people consider something as sacred, they have an inclination to interpret themselves as being closer to the sacred than others. I think that can be shown in the, let's say, don't take the word seriously, most primitive processes of collective self-sacralization in spontaneous group processes, but it is even true for very challenging universalist values, for example. Let's say Americans traditionally do not only praise the ideal of democracy, but also see themselves as being closer to that ideal and having a certain obligation to propagate this ideal everywhere in the world. Or the French and the ideals of human rights, for example, would be another such example. So the temptation, I would call that, to collective self-sacralization in the sense I've just described. And third, the emergence of ideas about transcendence and moral universalism. This is where the work I've done, and others, of course, José and Charles and many others on the axial age came in, namely the question, was there a fundamental point in the history of the sacred, so to speak, a fundamental rupture with this spontaneous tendency in the direction of self-sacralization? And transcendence, I think, is one of the articulations of a resistance against the spontaneous tendency of self-sacralization. Namely, if God is transcendent, for example, is not part of the world, then nothing in the world can be sacred just out of itself. It must not be venerated just as it is, as a mundane object. It is only possible to venerate it if it's seen in a connection to the transcendent divinity. I mention in the book that in the Catholic Mass, there is a prayer where God is addressed as the fons omnis sanctitatis, as the origin, the fount of all sacredness, because that means, I think, nothing maybe must be treated as sacred if it's not in this intense connection with transcendent, with the transcendent God. Now, this is a field of tension, as I said, which means one has to reconstruct the main types of politically relevant sacralizations in world history. In the book, I distinguish between, let's say, tribal self-sacralization, sacred kingship in early state formations and archaic empires, the sacralization of the nation in the history of nationalism, and the sacralization of the people in the history of republicanism and democracy, and the sacralization of the person in the history of human rights and the belief in universal human dignity, to which I've devoted my book called The Sacredness of the Person. I'm not saying these are the only forms of politically relevant sacralization. There clearly are other forms, let's say the sacralization of the ruler under the totalitarian conditions of the 20th century, the sacralization of nations, as I said when I mentioned the US and France, that claim to have a universalist mission, the self-sacralization of Europe as a post-national constellation that I think is currently happening in the EU, or the self-sacralization of the Catholic Church, because I think what we discuss with regard to sexual abuse and so on by priests, for example, I mean, that this is not just one scandal, so to speak, but two. The sexual abuse is one, but the fact that how bishops dealt with this scandal is the other scandal. And most of them, of course, behaved as they did, not really because they thought, oh, this is not so important, not so relevant, not grave, but because in their eyes, the church is itself such a sacred entity that the sacredness of the person, of the child, is a kind of negligible quantity in view of the self-sacralization of the church. So I'm ending by saying, I think what we need and what I'm working on is somewhat similar to what another main contributor to the secularization debates offered, namely the late British sociologist David Martin. I called his approach in the sociology of religion, a political sociology of religion. His explanation of secularization processes was very much in terms of political, institutional constellations between religious communities and, let's say, the state. I think we have to extend that beyond the limits of the debate about secularization to the debate about disenchantment, or to put it better, to the debate about the dynamics of sacralization and desacralization, detranscendentalization, and so on, and demagification processes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hans. And we're going to turn right now to some responses to your talk and to your book and to your larger project before we open things up to further questions from the audience. Our respondents today need very little introduction, as they're both well known around the world. Charles Taylor as one of the great philosophical voices of our age, and José Casanova as a preeminent social theorist and scholar of religion. I would simply like to mention a few points about their relationship with Hans Joas. The first is that, as Hans mentioned, the three of them were fellows together at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin in 2005-2006, during what was by all accounts a seminal period of exchange and collaboration in their work on their respective projects dealing with religion and secularization. So harmonious was their relationship that I'm told they were known at the time as the three Catholic tenors. Second, this troika came together again in 2015 and made significant contributions as plenary speakers to a major conference in Rome, organized by the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy, on the topic Faith in a Secular Age. In addition to those contributions, they continue to serve as members of the Council, giving important impulses to our work around the world. Lastly, in Hans's recent work, it becomes clear he thinks of Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, and Ernst Troeltsch as having constituted a sort of triumvirate of foundational early 20th century thinkers, blazing a trail for a historically and theologically grounded theory of religion. Who's to say that future scholars will not view these three with us here today as the leading lights of a renewed appreciation of the role of religion in our day, a sort of trinity of Religionstheorie. With that, we will hear from Charles Taylor first, and then from José Casanova.
Am I now audible?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm really immensely enjoyed, followed with great interest, Hans's masterful summary. I don't know how we got all that in so beautifully. And of course, I really basically agree with him. As you say, Bill, you know, the three of us worked very intensely together. And when I wrote my book, Secular Age, which really was in that period at the Wissenschaftskolleg, Hans and Jose had a great input into it. So it's not surprising that we agree. So what can I pick up on that may help push things a little bit farther? Well, I think what's really, I want to make 2 points. What is the big philosophical issue at stake between people who think like Max Weber and people who think like, as we do, is that they cannot bring themselves to accept the importance of hermeneutical self-understanding, right? Max Weber in the end was so convinced that our profound opinions, profound commitments, moral commitments were chosen, as it were ones that we put ourselves into. They were, I think an image he uses at one point, a kind of deities that we consecrate ourselves to. So it's ultimately a subjectivistic stance that is here, that obviously the disenchanted world in the sense of demagikified and scientifically scientifically understood world was the only sort of real objective reality there, that naturally this slide in the notion of disenchantment followed quite logically. But as Hans has shown in a lot of his work before this great book he's just been talking about, there is, you can see the human condition very differently, that we have these very powerful experiences of being called to something. And I think that this is something which has allows us to understand one of the things I tried to put in my book, with the tremendous importance of the seekers in today, because people who feel called to seek a path, it very often has the following structure, that they have this sense of I would say, a kind of ethically much higher demanding way of being, which they're very strongly drawn to. Clearly, someone in the Christian tradition, it's something to do with the notion of agape, of self-giving, of kenotic love. They're drawn very strongly to that, and they're trying to understand what this, what exactly, how to understand this, what it demands in concrete terms. And they're trying to understand, and here I bring another word that I used in one of my books, find the moral sources, the things that they can rely on, what they want to connect to in order to have the strength to carry through on this ethical transformation. And here is where you get the difference between the individual religious paths and ecumenicism. There is one of the things we discovered in the 20th century, but I mean earlier as well, and it's prefigured in the axial age, is how much the really great religious traditions are in the end pushing us in the same, inviting us or pulling us, as it were, in the same ethical directions, so that we find that the ethical advances we make are sometimes come from this tradition, sometimes that tradition. Then we think of Gandhi as bringing an element of non-violence into very important activity, which is very, as it were, adversarial activity of liberating yourself from the colonial power. And the way this then works its way out, Martin Luther King and the Manila against Marcos, the color revolutions in Eastern Europe, and so on. So these advances occur very often from different traditions, and then are picked up by the other traditions. But what can't be, as it were, melded together is this understanding of the path, what relies on the kind of prayer, the kind of liturgy, the kind of meditation, or whatever that one relies on to move along this path. And the really big cut between interpreting, understanding the modern world is, do you take this notion of calling seriously and consider that one of the great intellectual tasks it lays on us is understanding exactly what it is and in what direction and what can move us along? Or do you think this has ultimately to be judged simply as subjective reaction, in which case you're going to take the Weber path? And I think, I mean, I could go on along, but I shouldn't go on any longer. But Hans has done tremendous work in giving us a lot about if you like, I might almost say the phenomenology of this understanding of being called, which I think is essential to grasp what it is to have faith today. I could say a lot of other things, but that stand is, I hope, not too long.
Well, thanks. I'm sure we'll want to hear more from you, but let me turn now to José for your initial response.
Okay, it's a great pleasure to be here with you and with everybody. I'm very glad that the book has appeared in English. I read it in German, so I'm looking forward to reread it now in the English translation to refresh my memory. And I listened very carefully, and I'm very glad because it was a wonderful lecture indeed that you presented, Hans. 3 points. I myself as a Weberian, and obviously Max Weber's sociology of religion had a great influence on me. I always found the Disenchantment thesis the weakest point in his theory. Perhaps I only became aware of it fully when I came to the US and was confronted with empirical reality of the most scientific society in the world, with most Nobel Prizes, and yet full in what he would call an enchanted garden of beliefs in supernatural forces, miracles, etc. And this came most clear to me then to understand in the famous survey of the religiosity of college professors, in which the college professors in the faculties of the hard sciences, engineering, medicine were as religious as the rest of the American population. It was the college, the professors in the faculties of humanities and social sciences that were as secular as the European population. It was very clear that it was not scientific, if you wish, convictions per se, but something else that was at stake here. What are the presuppositions then that makes this thesis so plausible to some people? So in the 20th century, obviously there has been a lot of empirical evidence proving the thesis wrong. But this is not the contribution of Hans Joas. Other people have done it. Really, the importance of the book is to, if you wish, to challenge the thesis from within by precisely showing through masterful critical reconstruction of text, first in the three chapters of history, psychology, and sociology of religion, and then particularly in the really chapter on the Zwischenbetrachtung, the kind of the inconsistencies of the differentiation thesis, and the contrast with Ernst Strelch. To a certain extent, you could say that that Hans Joas himself in the last 20 years has been going more from Max Weber to Hans Strelch, and in a certain sense now is much more Strelchian. Perhaps always was, but because of the historicism, pragmatism, obviously, and again, because of precisely the rejection of the subjectivism of which the kind of the choice, the kind of the arbitrary notion of moral decisionism, if you wish, subjective ethical decisionism of which Charles has spoken. So this is one point. The second is, again, the fundamental really contribution is this critical reconstruction, painstaking reconstruction of text, the inner consistencies that undermine their plausibility, of convincing plausibility. Then, of course, the alternative narrative. And of course, Hans has very clear, this is not an alternative in the sense of a universal history of sacralization with a telos, etc. So we have to abandon the notion that we are going to substitute this universal theory of history by another. I myself have been using the thesis of sacralization, desacralization at key moments in history, because the axial age is very clearly a relocation of the sacred that opens up completely desacralization of things that were considered sacred and relocation of the sacred somewhere else. And I have also interpreted in Durkheimian ways the process of secularization as a form also of desacralization of ecclesiastical institutions and beliefs and resacralization of secular spheres of politics, the nation, the state. So the resacralization of nationalism, of the state, of the people. The fundamental question then that we come is, and one which also will be equally critical when we discuss moral universalism, is what are our then critical tools to be able to say which sacralizations are positive in which sense and which ones are negative. Now, if I say the sacredness of the human person, because it is a form of universalization of the person as person, not of any particular individual in his or her individual aspect, but only insofar as they share precisely this personhood. yes, we can accept this, as this, I think, the fundamental notion in which Durkheim was right about the new cult of the individual, although he was not able to present it in clear terms. But in the way, even in the way in which Hans has presented, it's clear that in his case, this comes to a certain extent natural, because in a view or in a belief in a form of transcendence, it actually is able to then give sacrality to the human person insofar as created in the image of God. So of course, this is very clear in which the sacredness of the human person here, theologically, Hans is able to use it or link it to his own belief in transcendence. Now, this becomes, of course, more difficult for other theological traditions. And here we are entering into the question of moral universalism and the fact that we are dealing with competing universalisms, multiple universalism, that every universalism is still particularly embedded in specific historical moments that, of course, cannot claim to be universalist. It's only, if you wish, a claim that eventually may be proven right, but we don't know. So it is this openness, this contingency of history, precisely to say, at this moment, this is a form of sacredness or sacralization that seems to us does it without doing any form of violence, of power, in the way in which the sacred, the power of the sacred has been used so frequently precisely for sacralizing violence, sacralizing precisely oppression and hierarchies. So yes, I'm fully with Hans' project, and I think that our task is then to develop more clearly the limits also of this theory of resacralization, and to be open not to try to fall into already a very clear linking of this sacralization with the theory of moral universalism. We can discuss this later, and obviously we'll have opportunities, but those were only some points I wanted to offer.
Thank you very much, Jose. Back to you, Hans. We've heard from Charles. He's taken some of the ideas in your book to India and Gandhi, or to the figure, the modern figure of seekers, religious seekers today. Jose has accused you of leaving the fold of Weberian sociology to become a Trelchian theologian, and raised the rather troubling notion of relative universalisms, I guess. Any thoughts that you have in response to their interventions?
Yes. Okay, let me sort things out in my mind a little bit. I understand, Charles, and thank you very much for your remarks, as emphasizing the point in Weber's thinking, so to speak, where his analysis of the world history of religion and the myth of disenchantment is connected to his understanding of, let's say, the existential situation in the modern world, and to the indisputable fact that his ethics, if one wants to call it his ethics, has a somewhat decisionist character, the emphasis on choice and existential decision making in a highly individualized way, and so on. Now, of course, I'm not saying that decision does not play any role, that we only follow the voices we hear or the calls we receive. I may remind you of the fact that when I distinguished between spontaneous processes of sacralization and the formation of ideals, I said reflection comes in, so to speak. I experience certain things, but I have to decide whether I follow the spontaneous inclinations or whether I struggle with them and try to repress them or to channel them or whatever. Actually, I could say this is something I learned from you in the 1980s, from your writings about first and second order volitions, that we have spontaneous inclinations of different kinds, and that we also have we develop reflective attitudes toward our spontaneous inclinations, so that we can ask, on the one hand, where do these inclinations come from? Are they just parts of our biological endowment or of the socialization processes or whatever? But we can also ask, and where do these second order things come from? And I would say my whole theory of the experience of self-transcendence is on that level of what you call the second order volitions. And I've learned a lot from you, because you are able to discuss these ideas in connection with the debates in analytical philosophy, in this particular case with Harry Frankfurt and so on. And this is not really my business, so to speak, but it has sensitized me to other thinkers who I think, maybe using very different terminologies, have also moved in the same direction. And I would indeed say, and I will come back to that when I respond to José, but that Ernst Strölch is a crucial author in this connection. Not his empirical studies on the history of Christianity, but his other 1,000-page book on historicism and its problems. I really see that as a major achievement, and it is so interesting to see that many people, I realize, sometimes don't know that, how close Max Weber and Ernst Strölch were personally. I mean, they lived in one and the same house, the two families, for a decade or so in Heidelberg. But the bad thing about the history of reception is that because of their closeness, many people think Strölch is just a somewhat milder version of Weber. And Weber is the more interesting, so to speak, because he's not so mild, but makes very clear-cut statements and is a kind of aggressive personality also in political matters and so on. So that it's fun to struggle with him, so to speak. But I don't see Strölch as this milder, less interesting version, but as really a fundamentally different version, namely a version of thinking in which our existential decision-making and our study of history or the specificities of the present come better together, so to speak, than if we think of we are studying history on the basis of our value convictions, but the value convictions are simply things that we decide about and that are not themselves formed in the processes we study, or that our own processes of decision-making are disconnected in Weber from the processes of the study of history. That opens a gap, and I think he bridges this gap, despite his emphasis on non-linearity, non-teleology, anti-evolutionism, and so on, with latently evolutionist or teleological conceptions like ongoing process of rationalization, ongoing process of disenchantment. And I could tell you, when you criticize that Weberians always say, no, how can you say this is teleological? Weber is the arch anti-teleological thinker. Yes, but if his understanding of rationalization is not at least mildly teleological, I don't understand it at all. I mean, it loses its meaning, so to speak. Yeah? So I would say we have, that has something to do with the book we discussed in 2 hours. We have to bring together thinkers like you, Charles, Paul Ricoeur, Ernst Strölch, and so on, for this more sophisticated understanding. Just one sentence about Gandhi. In the book I'm presently writing, and that part of the book is based on a series of lectures I gave in Weimar as Nietzsche fellow. There is a chapter on Gandhi, because I find Gandhi extremely interesting for my purposes, so to speak, in my framework, because in Gandhi, I would say we have a thinker who is confronted with the pseudo-universalism of the British colonial power. The Christian or let's say civilization-oriented pseudo-universalism of a suppressive colonial power. And what he does is not saying, I'm anti-colonial, so I'm critical of universalism. But he says, your universalism is not truly universalist. And I can show you how we in India can mobilize elements from our own spiritual tradition and bring in other components and turn this into a superior form of universalism. I always quote Gandhi's response to a journalist when he was asked, what do you think about Western civilization? And I like the answer very much. It would be a good idea. That would exactly be my answer, so to speak. Yeah, it is a good idea, but when you use it, you British, so to speak, you use it in a way, I mean, that to which your actions do not really fit, so to speak. Okay, now José, you are a Weberian. I know that very well, but I would say very often, and for good reasons in sociology, Weberian has become the term for the self-characterization of people who are, as sociologists, not only interested in the present, but in long-term processes, and who have a comparative orientation and do not only study the contemporary Western world or whatever, or their own country only. And if that is the meaning of Weberian, of course, I'm a Weberian, you are a Weberian, and yeah. But within these approaches of comparative and long-term historical sociology, I think, one can distinguish different contributors then, and there is no reason to buy the very specific features of Weber's approach there. And I'm sure, for example, let's say if we talked about what Weber says about China, so I mean, you would say, no, I don't agree with that. And so the question, of course, is, are these just some empirical weak spots in an otherwise perfect methodological approach? Or are the empirical weaknesses connected also to weaknesses in the methodological approach? I'm grateful to you that you mentioned my interpretation of Weber's Zwischenbetrachtung, because I didn't mention that in my talk. And I also think, I mean, I expect Weberians to defend my critical analysis of that influential text. And I'm, of course, very happy that you found it, at least to some extent, plausible. Now, this whole area of moral universalism. Let me go back for a second to Karl Jaspers as the one who invented the term of the axial age. I really think Jaspers was the man who understood that we live in a world of coexisting universalisms. But that does not mean everybody is a universalist, but there could be a coalition of universalists against particularists, so to speak. And there are also many versions of particularism. So for him, let's say morally and politically, if a Catholic is a moral universalist, he's on his side. If a Protestant, if a Muslim, if a Buddhist, if a secular Kantian, a secular Habermasian, it's the grand coalition of moral universalists against all forms of, let's say, Catholic, nationalist, Nazi, and so on, versions of particularism. So, but this does not mean that universalism is just a vague thing. It's a very strong demand that is being articulated in very different ways, so to speak. And now a crucial point is where I would say, I think I'm on the side of Charles Taylor and Jürgen Habermas is on the other side, so to speak. Yeah, do we think that necessarily there can only be different particular forms of moral universalism? Or do we think that the only true and radical form of moral universalism is a moral universalism based on secular rationality, so that the others may have their historical merits, so to speak, in the history of secular rationality, but at some point they are inconsistent and only the secular rational version is the intrinsically consistent one. And I think that's wrong. We will live forever in a world with a family of competing and communicating moral universalisms, where each specific version can learn a lot from the other specific versions. And of course, that will also be to some extent conflictual. There will be points where we will have to discuss. I derive from my moral universalism this and that, and you come to a different conclusion. So how can we come together there? Yeah, okay.
Thank you again. Let's take some of the remaining time to draw in some questions from our audience. We have quite a few. I've picked out several, though. One of them is from Paulo Fontes, and he says, the presentation of the different arguments about the use and the meaning given to the Weber text in German appears like a confirmation of the new and last understandings of secularization as proposed by Charles Taylor. Is that indeed the case? I just wonder if you can, if the two of you can offer any comments about points where you might differ in your analyses of secularization very broadly. Charles, you want to take that first?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that there's lots of room for disagreement here, because what I tried to do in the secular age is give some of the motivations, the hints, the things that were pushing people towards the kind of secularist view in the end, which we're identifying with Weber, that it ends up with, where any continuing belief is just sort of a leap in the dark that you feel like taking. And I think you can see what these are. I mean, one of the really big differences between 1500 and the present is this incredible sense we have of ability to control our social development, and above all, controlling the universe. And of course, this has been the terrible, in a way, poison pill, because we've enabled to put ourselves in terrible risks. So that's, if you really invest very heavily in the positive notion of this kind of ability to control. And then, I mean, there's a whole lot of other temptations which come along, like the temptation to downplay the importance of the hermeneutical understanding of the things that really draw us. And once you do that, then you incline towards the view that it's only natural science, which is giving us a positive view of things. So I think that I mean, since I wrote the book, a lot of people have written me saying, you've forgotten this, you've forgotten that. And most of them are right. I mean, it would have to be, if I had to rewrite the book and let the world be saved from this, it would be, as wide as this room. But I think those are a couple of factors that are extremely important in motivating, but not rendering inevitable or rationally undeniable a move towards a secularist view.
Hans?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I understood the question completely. I mean, if the question was, is what I am saying nothing?
The question is,
what Charles already said in his book.
I think just very broadly, it was to what extent do your findings and conclusions about disenchantment more broadly, secularization more specifically, diverge from Charles' account in A Secular Age and beyond?
Okay, I mean, I have the greatest admiration for Charles's work, but when it was published, I wrote, I think so far it's only published in German, a long review essay on it. And in that review essay, I identified 2 points that may be controversial or that are not identical. The first is I have the feeling that in your book, there are still, let's say, traces of a teleological argument in two, and traces I would not accept, so to speak, in two respects. One is when you write about the reform impulses in the Catholic Church and in European Christianity, you use the term, there is a vector of an ongoing reform process. And I don't think that is a good description. The term vector also sounds as if one could sum up different attempts at reform to one long-lasting process of reform, so to speak. And I'm skeptical with regard to that. I would say, yes, there are such attempts at reform, but then there are counter movements, so to speak, and they don't add up to one vector. And something similar is the case with regard to your notion of the Nova effect for the multiplication of religious options in the more recent past. But I also think this is a highly original term, so to speak, Nova effect. But it sounds again as if there is a kind of endogenous dynamism instead of a study of the processes that lead to the multiplication or reduction of these options. And the second point is that the whole construction of the book, A Secular Age, is based on this distinction, the world before 1500 and the world after 1500, so to speak. And I mean, it's such a magisterial work. You can't write about everything at once and so on and so on. But the reason why I was a little bit unhappy with this specific structural decision is that I think in order to understand the world of European medieval Christianity, one cannot treat it as being similar to, let's say, the world before 1500 anywhere. But one has to see that medieval Europe is characterized by the great influence of an axial religion that could not have emerged in the European Middle Ages. So you have medieval Christianity, a religion that is in a certain sense more advanced than the conditions in which this Christianity lives in the Middle Ages. So I would have preferred a kind of threefold construction, so to speak, that the world before the axial age, the world after the axial age, when axial innovations get into a world that is more primitive than the world that gave rise to the axial innovations, and then this world moving up to the level, so to speak, of the axial innovations from 1500 on. So these are two possible points where it might be interesting to discuss divergences.
Thank you. I think we have fertile ground there for further discussion and dialectic about these issues. But let me turn to another question from the audience. This is from Kim Jason Vieska. Do you think that disagreements, apart from doctrinal ones, among the major religions emanate from the fact that their self-sacralization process allowed them to think highly of themselves? Example, the concept of anathema that is still widely used by the Orthodox Church, or the pre-Vatican II seeming monopoly of the truth, or the concept of infidels of Islamic faith. Do you see self-sacralization at the root of religious fundamentalism and conflict? And I thought I'd put that to you, Hans, but also to Jose, who likely has some thoughts on Jose, any thoughts on that one? Sorry, you're muted.
Yes, I think
Yeah.
that the concept of self-sacralization can be used very well to ecclesiastical institutional structures that have established power in the way in which precisely Joas has shown. Obviously, even theologically, it's very clearly that the Ecclesia Invisibilis, which is the one which is sacred, is very different from the Ecclesia Visibilis, which is, of course, full of sin. And so every Catholic theologian should know that, right? And then to use our ecclesiastical institution as being the representation of the not only the sacramental in faith, but the real representation of the Ecclesia Invisibilis. Anyhow, so even within each tradition, I think there are defenses against this self-sacralization. But in reality, all traditions continuously self-sacralize themselves in a way with their own tradition is more critical than this self-sacralization. So yes, of course, the notion of infidels, I mean, this classification of heretics, infidels, pagans, was of course the old classification that came out of the Axial Age, that's true. And it was used by all the monotheistic religions. But precisely in the encounter of globalization of the different religions, that we've moved from this classification of the true religion and the false religions, heretics, schismatics, infidels, pagans, to a new classification, which I call precisely mutual recognition through denominationalism, global denominationalism, a process of mutual recognition of the claims of each religion, although we do not accept the objectivity of the claim, but we accept the right to their claims. And so, yes, I think in general terms, yes, this is a form of self-sacralization that can be used then to be self-critical of one's own tradition, of all of them.
I think the crucial point in my eyes is that institutions, or maybe even individuals or smaller groups, can have a tendency to act as if they are the owners of truth, as if they have reached an insight that is superior to everybody else's insight, and that is given to them and they defend against all others. That makes, I think, this whole, let's say, experientialist argument about religion so important. Namely, to emphasize that what we say about God is that it's always us speaking about God, so to speak. It's never God speaking. Or if I say God said that, it's me who says that. That I think the crucial thing with regard to sacred scriptures is to see these are human beings writing down what they consider to have received from God. If we make that reflective turn, and this has taken place, of course, since Schleiermacher and so on, then the authority structure of religious institutions becomes different, is destabilized, so to speak. And we develop a more modest attitude toward our own religious tradition and a more open-minded and interested attitude to other religious traditions, because then we do not look at us as being the owners of truth and the others as being the enemies of truth, or those who have no truth, so to speak. But we see that we try to approach something that can never be fully articulated in human terms, and that the others also try to do that, so that we are all insufficient and we may learn something from that. I think we get more humble when we see it like that. And in that sense, I would not simply use the label self-sacralization here, but try to understand what the dynamics of this process of self-sacralization is, how it goes through the authority structures of institutions.
Well, thank you very much, my friends. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of our allotted time for this session. I offer my apologies to all of those. We had quite a few more questions that we were unable to get to, although they will be noted, and I will pass those on as food for thought to the panelists today. It remains to thank our respondents, and especially Hans Joas, for your lecture today, to commend the book to our audience, Hans Joas, The Power of the Sacred, and we will hope to see you again at future RVP events. Thanks for joining us, everyone around the world, and please be safe.
Thank you.